Well, hello, folks. I've got to explain that until early this morning, I was on a plane coming back from Houston, Texas. It was a very nice plane, but I didn't sleep at all. So that's why I have the coffee. And I hope to goodness that I can stay awake throughout all of this along with you. I hope you will too. And it's relevant that I was in Texas and before that Washington, D.C., because I came from the vortex of Donald Trump land. And I just want to make a slight apologia. Oh, gosh, there you go. We'll get it right eventually. Because I'd originally scheduled this a year ago to be what rights are missing from the US Constitution. And a year's gone by, and of course this has been an extraordinary year, and it mostly is in my life, to be honest. There are bizarre things happen all the time. I got my last client out of Guantanamo Bay for the terrorist part of it in January, and then a few days later, Donald Trump promises us 30,000 new clients there. And so things change very fast. And I thought that it would be useful in the context of understanding constitutional rights to put a slight twist on it today, rather than talk about rather dry issues of rights that aren't in the Constitution, to think about different ways that we can approach what the Constitution is really all about. And it's about protecting the vilified minority people from the overburdening violence sometimes of the majority who are exercising the tyranny of the majority. So I'm going to talk about the proper response to some of the things that Donald Trump has been doing for the last few days, which involves a bit about the rights that people need, but more it's about something else. The Constitution really is about protection by and large, but the flip side of the Constitution is about ideas and about the promotion of ideas. And when you think about what we all complain about, a large majority, not the MAGA folk in America, it must be said, it's really about right-wing populism. Some people go so far as to say it's wannabe fascism, and that's obviously slightly heated words, but that's what it's about. And, we act as if this is all there is out there. We talk about the right-wing people in Italy, Viktor Orban in Hungary, even Nigel Farage in Britain, and then obviously the king of them all is Donald Trump, as if that's the only thing that's out there. But, as I was growing up, there was a great conflict between different populisms, and the place we really used to look at for it was South America. And it was perhaps the place that was a struggle between a right-wing populism. You'd have the coups and the military generals and, your Pinochets and people like that. But at the other side, there was always the liberal left-wing populism. And we've got some of those now in Venezuela, which is why Donald Trump hates them so much. And so it's worth remembering that. And when we look at America today, I was in Washington and I was in New York before that, and I think it's true to say that the rank and file of the Democrats are very angry at the way that the Democratic Party is responding to Donald Trump. And it is a little bit because Trump is playing the game of what we say in America is flooding the zone. Flooding the zone is an American football term. I'm not a great cognoscenti of American football, but it means that you're flooding the end zone so that the defensive people don't know which way to look as to where the ball's going to get thrown for the touchdown. And Trump has been doing this so strongly. I mean, you have to admire at some level the energy with which he's started his second term. And he's certainly someone who's trying to achieve a lot of things. And he's flooding the zone, and all you hear in America, and to a greater extent in Europe, about Trump is a response to, oh my goodness, what mad things has he done today? And it's all in response to Trump. And that means that he is totally dictating the process and the whole narrative and discussion of society. And, I think sometimes that's very true here in Britain too. When I look at Keir Starmer, who is a Labour Party Prime Minister, he's not in opposition like the Democrats in America. He's in power. And yet so much of what he talks about is really trying to steal Nigel Farage's playbook. And there's a lot of fear about what reform is going to do in the upcoming elections. And, the Tories obviously are really terrified by reform, but so's the Labour Party. And you see Keir Starmer talking about immigration as if he can out-Farage. And he's talking about all sorts of fairly right-wing things in terms of reducing benefits and so on and so forth, which are really not liberal at all. And some people would criticize Tony Blair for that, but some of what Tony Blair did had a real sense behind it. I'll never forget the phrase that Tony Blair used, which was, when he was talking about crime, he wasn't talking about locking everyone up, but he used the phrase tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. And that sounded tough on crime, but actually what it allowed Blair to do, at least in part, was to look at the underlying causes that lead people to these things. And, there were plenty of criticisms to level at Blair. I indeed prosecuted him at one time on BBC television for the Iraq War. But nevertheless, I think he was much more canny about his use of language and about what he tried to do than Keir Starmer is. And what I want to talk about today is a form of offense, because we all know that the best form of defense is attack sometimes, or offense. And I think that's what we're missing. And I want to set this in the context of the second week of Donald Trump's time in power this time around. And the BBC had a very handy article about the 17 things that Donald Trump said he was going to do, and by and large went ahead and did in just his second week. And these were these. I'm going to have to, my eyesight's pretty bad. He proposed that the US would take over Gaza. He planned to put thousands of US aid people on leave. He proposed lots of tariffs, which obviously we've heard a lot more about. He pressed ahead with plans to incentivize federal workers to leave. And he went a lot further than that and fired a bunch of them. He sanctioned the International Criminal Court. He ordered that strikes against the Islamic State in Somalia, they were going to drone strike them. He withdrew from various United Nations institutions. He sent the first plane of deportees of the people he called the worst of the worst immigrants in the world to Guantanamo Bay. He demanded that Ukraine provide its rare earth materials to the US. We all know about that. He banned transgender competitors from women's sports. He released water from the dams in California. That was just to get back at the governor of California, who he doesn't like, over the fires there. He announced a task force to tackle anti-Christian bias, not something I've seen a lot of in the USA. He intervened in a dispute in the Gulf world. We'll talk about that in more detail. That's totally irrelevant, really. He removed climate change mentions from government websites. He increased access for Musk's Doge. He took away Joe Biden's security clearance, and he scrapped the task force about seizing assets from Russian oligarchs. Those were 17 things all in the second week, and you and I both know that since that second week, he hasn't really slowed down. And I just want to pick on 3 or 4 of those examples to talk about what someone like Keir Starmer could think about doing as an aggressive response to an illiberal populism, where Keir Starmer could try to be the liberal populist. Because there's nothing wrong with being popular, right? I do think one of the problems Keir Starmer suffers from is he's not really inspiring a lot of people. And over the years, I've watched certain politicians who were incredibly good at inspiration. I will never forget Mario Cuomo, the governor of New York, back in the day when the death penalty was supported by 85% of Americans. I was at a speech he gave where he just said, no, I disagree with this. And he went through why he disagreed with the death penalty. And he said he was never going to let it happen in New York. And, people re-elected him 4 times, and they re-elected him 4 times because even though they may disagree with him, they respected the fact that he had strong views and that he clearly believed in it. And I've always found this is incredibly important in trials I've done. I'm always talking to jurors who are in favor of the death penalty. And we get to talk to them afterwards about, how they felt, and you learn all sorts of embarrassing things about yourself when you do that. But it's really educational. And the one thing that's always gratified me is jurors have always said that even if they disagreed with me, they knew I believed what I was saying and I wasn't making it up. And I think that's incredibly important when you're talking about someone in Keir Starmer's position. So here I'm just going to offer my advice to Keir about how we could slow down right-wing populism by accelerating liberal populism. And I'm going to take an incredibly stupid example as the first one, because this is actually right up Keir's street. And it involves the LIV golf. I don't know if anyone knows or cares about it. I mean, there was that book about golf, Is a Good Walk Spoiled? Can't say as I'm a big fan myself, although my father-in-law will strike me dead for saying that. But LIV was set up by the Saudis, and it's a big money thing, and they attract people to it by paying them huge amounts of money. And it's in competition with the PGA, and there's been a big spat between the two. And obviously, one of the number one things in Donald Trump's world is golf. And I don't think this is really a populist thing on his part. I don't think most people care about golf, right? And there are some things that populists do that are just about what they care about. And I think perhaps this is one for him. But, Keir Starmer could have done something really populist in response to that. And it would never have pissed off Donald Trump. You don't always have to aggravate your opposition to be a liberal populist. But you just have to do things you really care about. And this, I would call him cool Keir if you'd just take a bit of my advice. How he would do it. Keir Starmer loves to play football, and I'm being a bit cruel here. This is a picture from the Daily Mail where he missed a crucial penalty for his team. He fluffed it over the bar. Face it, I would too. I'm not a football player. And his team lost 11-6 in that game. But, he loves his football. And one of the things that you have to do as a populist is you have to care about what the people of Britain care about. You can't, when you're doing death penalty jury work, you can't care about what liberal, lefty, commie pinko, liberal lawyers like me care about, because that's not your jury. Those 12 people all believe in the death penalty. You've got to care about what they care about. And in those instances, by and large, you're talking about the Bible, and I talk about the Bible a lot in capital cases. But here, if you want to get to a lot of British people, and you read about this in the papers, you may not care about it. Can't say I really care a lot. My team's Ipswich Town, the Tractor Boys. I keep a passing glance at how they do. It's not the end of the world. If they lose, they're about to be relegated again. I'm a bit proud of them because anyone called the Tractor Boys is not exactly Manchester United. But I don't really care that much. But so many people do. And indeed, I remember when I was a kid, Peter Turson did a play called Zigga-Zagga, and it was about how football was the religion of Britain these days. And so if Keir wanted to make friends, why wouldn't he respond to the biggest criticism that a lot of football supporters have, which is the endless escalation of the price of football tickets? And you may have been reading about Manchester United recently. The new owner, we won't name him, has been whinging about how they're in a really bad financial state, which I think they are actually through total fault of their own, buying a bunch of incredibly expensive players who haven't been very good. But he wants to build a new Old Trafford being the football ground, of course. And New Trafford is going to cost, I think, £2 billion, and supposedly it will be seen from Liverpool. But it's quite hard to make the argument to the punter who's paying £60 for a ticket to go to watch Manchester United that he should pay more next year because they want to build the stadium, which is what will happen, obviously. Now, what would happen if Keir Starmer said, I'm legislating that Premier League teams have to halve their ticket prices? Look, there'd be a bunch of complaining, but you know who would complain it? Only some very rich people, half of which don't even live in Britain, including Jim Ratcliffe, for that matter. He doesn't live in Britain anymore either, except when he comes to United. And they would complain, oh, you're taking away our profit. Well, and they would complain, well, if you do that, our teams will never win in international competition. If you just look at it briefly, that's not true. Only 20% of Manchester United's income comes from tickets. Only 5% of many teams come from tickets. The Manchester United's income on tickets is double the income of the competitors on the continent, both the Spanish League, which is exactly half of that, and the Bundesliga in Germany, which is half of that. So their argument's nonsense. And they're incredibly rich, and they just wouldn't be able to spend quite as much money on things they don't need, like a new stadium. They might sue you, and they might say, oh, well, you can't do this, we have legal rights. Well, actually, they're going to lose that in Britain. They might win it in America because they'd have constitutional rights, but they don't in Britain. So they would lose that. Keir Starmer would be a hero to all those people in the Red Wall area who care about football, which is a monstrous number of people. And it's just an easy one, right? That is what we call liberal populism, where you're doing something for the less well-off people who have a hard time paying for this sort of thing at the expense of the rich people, but you're doing it in a way that really makes a lot of people very happy. So there's one rather fatuous example, but I think it's probably an easy one for Keir, and it plays right to him. He could talk about football with passion, and he doesn't get to talk about a lot of things with passion. Let's talk about some of the other Trump ideas. The second one I want to talk about is the Gaza Riviera. Well, you may have seen that absurd thing that he sent around on social media, where someone had made this AI film that had him in a golden statue. It had Elon Musk throwing money up in the air. They were living on the Riviera of Gaza after they'd kicked all the Palestinians out. It's just a mad idea of cultural and real genocide. So what would you do in response to that? That was obviously an incredibly bad idea, and you can criticize it, but you're not going to win over any MAGA supporters because they live in America. They don't necessarily know a whole lot about where Gaza is. And they've certainly been indoctrinated that the Palestinians are Hamas and they're all terrorists. So he wins that argument from a right-wing populist perspective. Now, what would you do if you were cool Keir? And there are any number of arguments of what they might do. What Keir did was he did at least change Britain's stance on indicting Benjamin Netanyahu in the ICC, the International Criminal Court. He said, well, we're not going to block that as we had been trying, the Tories had been trying to before. But he didn't offer anything up. Now, I think most people in Britain, and certainly most people who Keir would want supporting him, don't think it's cool for genocide to be going on in Palestine/Israel. And I say this, I'm half Jewish, and I totally get the perspective of Israel. And I grew up going to a Jewish fraternity in America, which was very much like Israel. It was split down the middle between liberal Jewish people who were really my chums. They were all my chums in school, who were really supportive of Israel and would go there and be in kibbutzes. And then there were the right-wing people in my fraternity who just used to send money to Israel so they could have more fighting, basically. And I got to say, I side with my friends who cared about peace in Israel and thought that the response to the Holocaust is not to commit another Holocaust, but to try and establish peace. And back when I was young, I really idolized the Israelis in many ways, where they were, Shimon Peres and people before him were trying to get peace. And, you remember all these people getting Nobel Peace Prizes for the Camp David Accords and so forth. This was really important. And it would be very easy for Keir Starmer to take a strong position that we want to just help the children who are being killed in Gaza and do something to try to put an end to war. We all want to put an end to war. There's far too much talk about how we support people in war in Ukraine or wherever, and not nearly enough talk about how we put an end to war. And the thing I would do if I was Keir is I would assemble a Peace Corps. I loved the American version. That I had a dear friend who was a member of VISTA. And VISTA stood for Volunteers in Service to America. It's one of the fabulous acronyms I've ever come across. And these were young people who were sent out to help people in poor parts of America, and then the Peace Corps would go around the world and do fabulous things for people. And it would teach the young people of America that there was a world outside them that was much less fortunate than themselves, but at the same time it would do good and let Americans see the needs that other people have around the world. And if I was Keir, I would send 500 medical professionals, all volunteers, to Gaza, supported by the British government, with negotiations even with Netanyahu about this, to say we're just going to help the people who are being injured, not a bunch of terrorists, a bunch of children. There have been 40,000 odd people killed in Gaza, lots more injured. They're very, very short of medical supplies. The advantage of that is it would press towards peace too, because it would be supporting the liberal people in Israel, and it would be making it harder to bomb Gaza, because these people who go there would have to be somewhat courageous. I go to war zones all the time. I know what it's talking about. And they would have to be willing to go there, even though they know that the IDF might do something crazy and bomb them. And I think that would be a really genuine liberal populist thing that he could sell to Britain, and people would say, wow, yeah, that's someone standing up for his principles. The next one, about chasing Trump. What we tend to do is chase after Trump, and instead of doing our own thing. And, you know, he hates the ICC, the International Criminal Court. He imposed sanctions on it in that second week. He's banned a bunch of people. He imposed sanctions on the prosecutor and all sorts of people in it, banned them from coming to America. And of course, the US has not signed up to the Treaty of Rome, and they're not part of the ICC. In the long term, that's incredibly unwise, because we all know that the rule of all major empires or, you know, world leaders is one day you're not. You know, that's Britain's thing. We were once the big cheese of the world, and we're now not. And this is going to happen to America, and it's very short-sighted that America does not sign up to all of these international conventions. The US has not signed a single convention of the UN that's enforceable in an American court in a meaningful way, something that I've had to litigate only so much. So Trump attacks the ICC. Now, this is something that Trump wouldn't necessarily like Keir for doing, but it would be right up his alley. He was a human rights lawyer. He was also DPP, Director of Public Prosecutions, so he's into prosecuting people, which I wouldn't be, but he was. And that's what the ICC does. And so he needs to support it. And, you know, his old mate, David Lammy, was in Doughty Street too, one of the chambers here, and you could get a bunch of British barristers and solicitors too to volunteer to go help out the ICC, and you could trumpet it, and, you know, honestly, lawyers make more money than they deserve. They can do it all for nothing. My whole life's pro bono. I never represent someone for money. So certainly these big-time lawyers could do that, and they would be doing a good thing. And there would be plenty of British lawyers who would volunteer to do that, to go to the ICC and help them. The ICC is criticized for not going fast enough on any of its prosecutions. Well, that's largely because they don't have the support, so let's give it to them. That's something where Keir Starmer could stand up and say, I want to prosecute these genocidal maniacs. Of course, the ICC tends to look mostly at African countries and a group of people who we think we can look down on, which is just wrong. But they have, of course, indicted Netanyahu. They've often tried to charge Putin. And we could just support that whole process in terms of enforcing human rights through the ICC. That's populist liberalism, or liberal populism. Here's another thing. Blowing up the United Nations. You know, this is really this isn't obviously the UN being blown up, it's another building, but I just thought it looked close enough. But Trump hates the UN, even though it does a lot of good stuff for the United States. It's there in New York. It's great kudos for the US to have it there. I personally, you know, look, the UN is incredibly inefficient, but it's the hope for the side in many ways. UN peacekeeping forces are clearly an incredibly important role that they play. They play a very important role in different conventions, human rights conventions. And we need to encourage that. And Keir Starmer is a big supporter of the UN, even though he doesn't say it very loudly. Trump is not, because it plays well to his audience to say, you know, we're American, we can do it all ourselves, we don't need these foreigners, we don't like the UN, why should they tell us what to do? Why should we pay so much money to the UN? The US has historically paid a huge amount of the UN's budget, which was a very sensible thing for the US to do. Well, what would you do as Keir Starmer in response to that? This is a more controversial thing, but it's certainly what I would do. Look, I was once, when I was doing death penalty trials and work in the Deep South for 25 years, I would represent every single British person who faced the death penalty, largely because I normally got a call from the British embassy or the British consulate asking me to, and, you know, whatever, I'm happy to do it, of course. For some reason, I got invited to go to the White House Correspondents' Dinner one time, and I was sitting with the UK ambassador at the table. I won't name him, nice guy. We were having an interesting conversation. And I was asking him about Britain's role in the world. And one thing I've never understood is, as you know, there are 192 members of the UN. The Security Council, some of the people rotate, but 5 countries are permanent members, and they all have a veto. And those countries are the US, China, Russia, UK, and France. Now, I'm not a big fan for one country to have a veto. It seems terribly undemocratic to me. But it's very hard to see why the UK and France should have a veto when there are lots of other countries, you know, India, Brazil, Indonesia, all these massive countries, much, much bigger than Britain, that don't have vetoes. You know, how is it that we can justify that? And I asked the ambassador that, and he says, well, it allows us to punch above our weight. Well, I'm sure that's true, but it's not a good reason to trample on a democratic principle. And we went on to the whole issue of nuclear weapons. Because, again, we have all these nuclear test ban treaties, nuclear ban. You know, Iran wants to have nuclear weapons, and Donald Trump's threatening to bomb them all if they do that. North Korea says they have nuclear weapons, and, you know, that's probably the only reason they haven't been invaded recently. And Israel has nuclear weapons, apparently, and various people around Israel want them. My view is that nuclear weapons are mad. Of course, you all know that we have this theory of deterrence, which is called mutually assured destruction, MAD, MAD. It means that as long as we're sure that if someone attacks us, we can just obliterate them too, and everyone in the world dies, that's going to keep world peace. And that's a theory, but it's totally, totally deranged. And it makes it very difficult for the British to argue around the world that people shouldn't have nuclear weapons when we have them and we insist we should keep them. That's called hypocrisy. And, you know, the US is not going to give up its nuclear weapons anytime soon. The US basically controls the British ones too. So we're not really going to do anything without the US agreeing to it. The French are slightly different, but I just don't think we should have them. And they keep saying it's going to be $40 billion to create our new system. It goes up every year. It's probably more than that. Now, if I was Keir Starmer, I would announce publicly that I really support democracy around the world, and I would say to the other countries in the world, look, let's negotiate. We're willing to give up our position on the Security Council that's permanent in favor of maybe a South American country, an African country, or, you know, whatever. We'd obviously talk to the French about it. I think we might have a hard time selling them on it, but we need to give that up, because if we're ever going to help support the UN, we've got to put our money where our mouth is. And I don't know if that would be a great vote winner in Britain, probably not. You know, the right-wing people would get all over you, but you could defend it because it's so obviously right. A slightly easier one, in my view, is nuclear disarmament for Britain, because that used to be a big issue when I was growing up, and it was a very 50-50 issue. And frankly, it's an issue that if I'm having an argument with someone who believes in nuclear weapons, I'm going to win that argument. This is not hard, because the whole thing is totally deranged. I feel slightly safer in Dorset now, where I live, than I did when I lived in East Anglia, because East Anglia, we were right next to the American bases that supposedly had some of the nuclear weapons, and we'd be the first to get blown up. Dorset, let's face it, who's going to bomb Dorset? But that's a silly thing, because a nuclear holocaust is going to kill everyone. You could sell that. You could save a lot of money, and you'd say, we're saving £40 billion, or whatever it is, and we're going to put that into the NHS. We're going to put that into a welfare system. We're not going to cut the welfare of people. We're going to cut our nuclear weapons because we don't need them, and only a mad person would ever use them. That's what I see as a liberal populist view that I think you could sell to British people in a way that would take us off the nuclear targets. And, you'd obviously get some pushback, but I think we win that argument. What's the next one? Okay, so he said that Donald Trump said he was going to take the worst of the worst criminal immigrants to Guantanamo. That's actually Guantanamo 3.0. And at the beginning of next year, I hope to have a whole lecture on the lessons we learned from Guantanamo 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. 1.0 was when we as Americans took Haitians there in 1991 because we didn't want Haitians coming to America. We were happy for Cubans to come because they were basically pretty white and running away from communism. But we didn't want Haitians because we're basically racist, and it was going to be a bunch of black people from Haiti coming. So instead we took them to Guantanamo Bay, and we argued they'd never got to America, and therefore they didn't have any rights. And the George H.W. Bush administration won that argument. And that was why they took the terrorists, the so-called terrorists, to Guantanamo in 2002, because their lawyers had advised them that the Constitution wouldn't apply to Guantanamo and they could just do what they wanted. And I'm proud to say I brought, with two friends, Rasul versus Bush, the first case that went to the Supreme Court on Guantanamo 2.0, and we won it. And we had the Supreme Court enforce the US Constitution in Guantanamo Bay, although not the whole of it. But we won it, and we basically got most of those people out. Now, as I said at the beginning, I had just got my very last of 87 prisoners out of Guantanamo on the Guantanamo terrorist thing, all of whom were basically shown weren't terrorists at all, when Donald Trump announces that he's going to take 30,000 of these worst of the worst criminal immigrants. And again, just like the terrorists, these are the vilified minority of people. He said they were all gang members wearing tattoos, which is what identified them, from Venezuela. And they made a big to-do about it. I got immediately involved in that. I mean, I didn't really want anything else to do, but we just can't have them do that stuff. And we won that battle in 2 weeks. It was really quite something. Finally, they woke up to the fact that all the people they were taking to Gitmo this time had come from America, which meant the US Constitution clearly applied to them. And so they were losing every time they turned around in court. And instead of it taking 20 years to clear the place out, it took 2 weeks on this one. And so, that's an example of how you fight illiberal populism, even though he went on and now he's doing this thing in El Salvador, but he can do not as much of it. And obviously we're fighting back on that as well. But, this is the applying the Constitution to fight back. But I want to think about what you do as a liberal populist, if you're Keir Starmer, not something that's, again, going to anger Trump or anything, where you can kiss up to him if you have to, or at least you have to not offend him intentionally, so his narcissistic impetuosity means that he turns his guns on Britain. You can be clever. You can be more sensible than some people are when they deal with Trump. You have to recognize who he is. But at the same time, you can do really good things. I mean, the first thing, you wouldn't do this if you were prime minister, but this just amused me, right? I mean, when you're arguing about immigrants, you really need to make the argument that immigrants benefit society, as they manifestly do. and certainly do in the United States of America, where they benefit everyone except the Native Americans. I mean, everyone's an immigrant, right? And I did love this thing about Donald Trump. You know, it's often said that immigrants take on much of the work that we would prefer to avoid, and that accounts for 2 of Donald Trump's 3 wives, both of whom were immigrants. There was Ivanka, who was his first wife, and Melania now. And I just thought that was funny. And I don't say that Keir Starmer should say that, because that wouldn't make him any friends. I just thought it was funny. But what should cool Keir do if he wanted to respond in a populist way? Well, there's no harm. He's pro-Europe, right? And Labour, they're just crazy when they think that you can't fight back on Europe. You know, the US Constitution is a good example of that. The Brexiteers say, oh, you can't have another vote, that's too much democracy of some sort. Well, no, that's not true. In America, when we amended the Constitution to ban alcohol, a few years later, we discovered this was a really stupid thing to do. There were more people drinking. They were all doing it illegally. They weren't paying any taxes. So we amended it back again. And we could be doing that on Brexit, and Keir could be standing up for the majority of British people who believe he should be doing that. But if he's not willing to do that, he can at least take on something that is obviously popular. The overwhelming majority of young people are against Brexit because they're the ones who suffer from it. My students, all the people I teach, they're all against Brexit. I think I've had one who thought it was a good idea. And part of it is they've been robbed of so many things in terms of the interactions with Europe. And so there's been some talk back and forth of whether we should reinstitute the ability of Europeans to come to Britain to go to university, at the same time British people to go to different European countries. Now, this is a win-win situation because the Europeans who come to Britain, they have to pay for coming here. They have to pay the same as British students under the old EU law. Now, we're having many fewer students now because right now as foreigners, they're liable to have to pay more. You know, the foreign students now have to pay at least twice and almost 3 times as much to go to university here. So that's a disincentive for people to come here. And it may mean you get more money from the individual student, but overall you get less people coming, fewer people coming. So he could make a big deal about how I just want to open up education the way it could be. And this is a really popular thing. I'm going to strike a deal with the EU, and it's equal. We win as much as they win, and young people in Britain can go do what they want on the continent at the same price as people get charged there. Now, in some of those countries, it's pretty much free. So that's a real benefit for young British people who can go study in places in Europe that would cost them almost nothing. And this is a popular small issue. It's a big issue for some people, but a relatively small one in the grand scheme of the EU that would set us on the path of moving back towards where we were and would win him votes among the people who thought it was a crazy idea to vote for Brexit, and wouldn't lose votes for the people who are against it. You know, if they're worried about immigrants, these are students. They can't stay after they finish unless they go through a whole other immigration palaver. So you can win that argument, again, if you make it, but you can't win it if you don't make it. Here's one more, I think, that we're going to have. Again, he wants to protect Russian oligarchs, and he wants to take Ukrainian natural resources. 2 things that are basically viewed in America as him, you know, hugging Putin a bit. But he pitches actually quite effectively in America that he's trying to stop the war, and all of the work he's done to protect, or America's done to protect Ukraine, has been incredibly expensive, and really they just need to pay a bit. And it's sort of like when he says that NATO, you know, the NATO members should pay more money. Why should America protect you against Russia when you're not spending enough? And Keir Starmer's response to that has been to say, we are going to spend more money on the military. In my view, that's just madness. When you plan for war, you make war much more likely to happen. If you do something else, you can perhaps diffuse it. Not always, but you think of World War I. There were so many ways that could have been prevented. It was a crazy war to have over some guy getting shot in Sarajevo. In World War II, similarly, if we hadn't imposed the Treaty of Versailles and crippled Germany, we wouldn't have given Hitler all the arguments he could make that were populist arguments towards becoming a total fascist. Now, would you always avoid that sort of right-wing fascism? No, not always, perhaps, but you should always be trying to stop it before the invasion happens. Now, what would you do if you were Keir? I think it's true that everyone in Britain, it's very easy to say to the British people, yeah, we support Ukraine, but what we really want and what the Ukrainians want is peace in Ukraine. That's what everyone wants. A lot of people getting killed there. And this is what the populist liberal response is. And it's just obviously sensible and it's quite easily saleable. So the question is then, what do you do? Now, there are lots of things you do as a populist that are just basically calling people's bluff, right? There are things that cost absolutely nothing to do, but that might help, might not. Now, one of the arguments that Putin makes for invading the Ukraine and being paranoid about his border with Europe is that Russia gets invaded. You remember what Napoleon did, and remember what Hitler did. There were millions of Russians killed in World War II, and there were many, many Russians killed in the Napoleonic invasion. These are things that America don't quite understand, because actually we've only been territorially invaded 3 times, and I can tell you the dates. There was 9/11, 2001. There was December the 7th, 1941, that's Pearl Harbor, and the War of 1812, where the British burnt the White House, which, according to, I don't know if it's totally true, but used to be the Grey House until the British burned it, and then it was redone as the White House. So the Americans don't have quite the same paranoia as the Russians. Whether Putin would stop if he wasn't afraid of that is a different question. A lot of wars are fought for domestic consumption. And actually, my experience with dealing with Russia over the last few years is that there's quite a lot of support among a lot of people in Russia for this war because of the propaganda. But you can try some things, and I'll tell you what I would do if I was Keir Starmer. I would call Donald Trump, and I would say, Donald, I know you're friends with Putin, you're trying to get him to do the right thing. Back in 2000, we were all mooting the idea of Russia joining NATO. To the extent that Russia views NATO as the threat, and they don't want Ukraine to be a member of NATO, we were saying to the Russians back then that, why don't you consider joining it? And indeed, Putin said he wanted to, and there was a debate with a British military person about that that's quite well publicized. I think if I called, or better Keir called, Donald Trump and said, here, I've got an idea, this happened in 2000, why don't you, Donald, or Mr. President, whatever you like to call him, why don't you propose to Vladimir that he should join NATO? And we'll let Ukraine join NATO too. We'll have everyone in NATO. Then we're all sworn to defend each other against invasion. And at that point, that should take that fear away from Vladimir Putin. Now, is he going to say yes? I don't know. But you could be a populist and you could say, we want peace. And we're going to propose this as a way to perhaps get towards peace by making this massive concession to Russia. Let's see what happens. I got to say, I bet if Keir said to Donald, you take the credit for this, I'm going to support you the whole way, I bet he'd do it. And I think that's the sort of thing that a liberal populist can do, rather than saying what Keir's saying now, which is let's have more money to pay for more arms to make sure Ukraine can keep the war going. Let's do all the things we can do to try and stop it. So, look, those are really the things I wanted to talk about. And, when I was thinking about the 17 reasons, actually I had a response for all 17 of things I would like to do. And so would you, I'm sure. I think it's a good thing to think about. And I'd love to hear about your thoughts about those 17. And my email is normally up there, but if it's not, it's clive@justiceleague.org.uk. And I'd love to hear from you about it, because these are things I think we need to be proposing to Keir Starmer to try to get him to come out of his shell a bit and to start doing some inspirational things that don't cost a lot of money for the most part, but are just ideas that he could sell and he could really stand up. You don't have to take all my ideas. I know that if I was Prime Minister, I probably wouldn't have got elected. Who knows? But I'd certainly give it a good old try. And I would certainly talk about what I believe in. And I think Keir needs to do a whole lot more of that and have ideas that oppose, that are not just negative, look, Donald Trump's mad, let's oppose what he's doing. Instead, we're going to propose something that is parallel but takes us in the right direction. That is an incredibly important part of what the Constitution should be considered as. It's not just a protection against the bad acts of the powerful. It's also something in the First Amendment that allows you to talk about all the different ideas that you might have to do something positive. And the First Amendment also gives you the right to challenge your own government and try and get them to do it. So I'd like to think we could do that. Let's just finish on this note, that ideas about promoting good ideas, they're not just about protecting us from bad ideas. Thank you very much.